The Heritage of Streshin. After a 60-year search, two seemingly disparate phenomena came together to define the maternal grandparents with whom I had lived during my most formative years. One was a death march in 1945. The other, a discovery by an MIT professor in 1996. The result was my Heritage of Streshin. In December 1944, my mother's brother Shale, a surgeon from St. Louis, Missouri, serving with the 101st Airborne, was captured by the Germans at Bastogne during the so-called Battle of the Bulge. After he discarded his dog tag, he was marched into and then across Germany and into Poland, where life in a POW camp, though not pleasant, was apparently tolerable. But as the Russians advanced from the east, his German captors were ordered to march their prisoners west. And so began a disastrous death march across Poland, back into Germany, during which over one-half of the troops died. There was little, if any, food, and the captors themselves were forced to forage for food to survive. Many prisoners starved to death. Many others died of disease, and there was constant bombardment, often mistakenly, by Allied aircraft. My Uncle Shale was already a hero of the D-Day invasion, where he had led a team which glided into Normandy ahead of the invading Allied troops, and had set up a surgical station behind enemy lines. During the death march, however, Shale became a legend. According to accounts later memorialized in the book Frontline Surgeons, and in post-war letters to Shale from the guards themselves, Shale, emaciated, had trudged at the end of the line of march and treated not only the American prisoners of war, but wounded German civilians as well. The Germans considered him a heaven-sent miracle, and they wondered where such an amazing human could have come from. One who could sublimate hate and fury amidst the chaos of Nazi hell and Allied bombardment, and minister to enemy civilian wounded because he took the Hippocratic Oath so seriously. Where could such humanity have come from? I doubt they ever knew. I determined to find out. In 1992, an MIT professor named Sheldon Benjamin lectured in St. Petersburg. The Russians apparently liked what they'd heard, and in 1996 they invited him back. Benjamin's maternal grandmother had emigrated from Streshin, a village in what is now Belarus, as did my maternal grandparents in 1903, when they were both barely out of their teens. While in Russia in 1992, Benjamin visited the village of Streshin briefly. As a quid pro quo for his 1996 lectures, he requested and was granted permission to visit the former shtetl at some length and to interview its inhabitants. His in-depth report opened my eyes to a civilization I had known only vicariously through close association with my grandparents. As I read it, I came to realize that I had stumbled upon many remarkable components of the miracle of the Death March. Here, then, is Benjamin's story. Sheldon Benjamin's maternal grandmother had told him stories of life in Streshin all through his childhood. They were so detailed that upon arriving there in 1992 and again in 1996, he immediately knew his way around. Benjamin's children accompanied him on the trip, and they kept a separate diary. They described many aspects of Streshin, just as my grandparents did. In many ways, Streshin is a village frozen in time. It is located on the Dnieper River, and women still wash their clothes in the river. The houses are small, but they're beautiful, all painted different colors, and the woodwork and the trim is exquisite. Life proceeds much as it did in the late 1880s, when my grandparents were raised there, save for a few paved roads and an occasional television antenna. But something vital is missing. Streshin was once a town vibrant with Jewish life, but all of that is but a shadow now. Benjamin likens Streshin to a museum devoid of art. The structure is intact, he mused, but all one sees on the walls are the gray shadows where gilt-framed pictures once hung. This is undoubtedly an apt metaphor, for the following is the riveting description of the Streshin of the 1880s and 1890s inhabited by my grandparents, as pieced together by the Benjamin clan. First, a bit of ancient history. Streshin was founded in 1127 as a fortress on the border of the Principality of Polotsk to defend against the Kievan Rus, reportedly descended from the Vikings. It was originally named Strizhev. Ownership passed to the Chermigov Principality and then to the Kiev Principality. In 1399, Prince Betovt of Latvia, later Lithuania, annexed Strizhev for the Church of Vilnius and added it to the great princedom of Litvia, changing its name to Streshin. Although Streshin was destroyed several times during the 15th and 16th centuries, at one time becoming part of the Confederation of Poland and the Great Latvian Princedom, in 1722 was annexed by Catherine the Great, along with the rest of the Rogachev Province of Mogilev Gubernia. In the 1780s, Catherine gave the Streshin area to a noble named Fyodor Osterman, whose property outside Streshin retained the name Ostermansk into the 20th century. The peasants of Streshin were tenants of Ostermansk until 1917 revolution. My grandparents, Chaim, Harry, and Razel, Rose, Dworkin, grew up among these peasants during the 1880s and 1890s. Jews were known to live in the Great Latvian province from its establishment in 1242 and appear to have been in Streshin by the 16th century. In the 1880s, when my grandparents were born and raised there, 552 of Streshin's 1,064 residents were Jewish. The Jews lived in 109 of the 184 houses in town. At that time, there were 2 shops, the Orthodox Church, a synagogue, 2 cheters, those are Hebrew schools, a river pier, and a marketplace in Streshin. Of far more significance than the architecture, however, was the life of the community. That is the essence of its heritage. Here is Benjamin's vivid description of that life, almost verbatim from his 1996 report. The Jewish community of Streshin had supported at least 15 charitable organizations. There was, of course, the Chevra Kadisha, or Burial Society, that prepared Jewish bodies for burial. The Shomrim Society would provide 2 guards to stay with the body from death to burial. The Chevra Tehillim Society would get together to study Psalms and would raise money for charitable projects. Benjamin's grandmother recalled her father leaving at 5 a.m. to study Psalms with this group before morning services. The Gemilas Chesed Society made interest-free loans to those in need. The women of the Lechem Evyanim Society would visit the homes of those Jews who had agreed to bake extra challah every Thursday morning and then distribute the loaves collected to the needy Jews in time for their Shabbat meal. They would gather and distribute extra produce in the same fashion. The Bikur Cholim Society would harvest ice from the Dnieper every winter and store it in straw-lined underground cellars along the river. The society members would then deliver ice to families of those with fever throughout the year. They would also raise money for a fund to help families who needed to travel to the city for medical care. There was also a Jewish book society who would hire book reviewers to come from nearby cities and raise money for the lending library. This remarkable civilization was destroyed in its entirety by the Einsatzgruppen in 1941, following Hitler's invasion of Russia, as were myriads of other shtetl communities throughout Eastern Europe. The records of Yad Vashem reveal that 1,244 of Streshin's Jews, all that remained, were shot and buried in a mass grave they were themselves forced to dig. Benjamin visited what was left of the Jewish community and its cemetery. For 4.5 centuries, Jews had flourished in Streshin, and today only one gravestone remains. But Streshin was a vaccination that took. And as I remembered my grandparents, it all began to make sense, this heritage of Streshin, this nobility of their offspring Shale, and his unstinting beneficence on the death march. My grandparents lived quietly, and they lived patiently, always remarkably tolerant of human foibles. They were colorful people, living always with humor. They smiled a lot. They had an extraordinary work ethic, and they were self-sufficient. Chaim and Rezel lived through 2 world wars and numerous recessions, and of course the Great Depression, and they survived it all with their humanity intact. They were selfless people, and there was a certain simplicity in their lives. There were no airs about them. They did not pretend to knowledge or sophistication which they didn't possess. When they suffered, and during World War II they suffered much, they did so quietly and with dignity. They were highly moral people, and they loved this country with a passion that only those could who had lived through Russian pogroms and repression and then found freedom and meritocracy here. I was privileged to live with them. This is what I remember. Chaim and Rezel Dworkin moved on to Englewood Road across from Garfield High School in the early 1930s. My first recollections of their home were of a laconic Native American, barber, who lived upstairs, and a grape arbor which grew in the backyard. In the depths of the Depression, my grandparents took in the barber as a boarder. He was a full-blooded Native American, and I just called him Indian Joe. It was long before the era of political correctness. Besides, Indian Joe was my favorite character in Huckleberry Finn. Since my mother's 2 brothers, Shale and Martin, were in medical school, and we lived apart from my grandparents at the time, there were spare bedrooms in the Englewood house. It was not unusual for folks to take in boarders at the time. In fact, the phenomenon had become so much a part of the American culture during the Depression that a cartoon entitled Our Boarding House with Major Hoople appeared almost daily in the Cleveland press, and the papers were full of classifieds advertising for boarders. So my grandfather took in his barber. He liked the man, but I don't think poor Indian Joe could afford much in the way of room and board. So my grandfather let him earn his keep. Grandpa found an ancient barber chair somewhere and installed it in the basement of his Englewood house. I remember the musty old leather smell about the chair when it first arrived. In any event, once every 2 weeks on Sunday, there was a haircut ritual. My father, my grandfather, and I would march down to the basement and take turns in the old barber chair as Indian Joe proceeded to cut our hair. And he always finished off the haircut with a dash of bay rum or witch hazel. They both smelled pretty good, actually, and the smell lasted until you took a shower the next morning. I will forever associate that smell with Indian Joe and the Englewood basement bi-monthly Sunday haircut ritual. There was one other thing about Indian Joe, beside the constant smell of bay rum and witch hazel. He was a checkers genius. If there were such a thing as a checkers grandmaster, he would be it. He simply never lost. I remember my grandfather trying often. My grandmother told me he used to try every night after work. He never won. Played to a draw occasionally, but could never beat Indian Joe. Not even once. I guess old Joe must have played a lot of checkers down at the old barber shop. You know, in the 12th century, the great sage Maimonides defined 10 degrees of charity, the highest and most noble being the enabling of a man to fend for himself, to earn his own living, and thus to maintain his sense of self-esteem. To my knowledge, my grandfather never studied Maimonides, but in his own humble way, he had reached that highest plateau in befriending Indian Joe and enabling him to earn his keep in dignity. It's a lesson I never forgot. The grape arbor was extensive, and it grew very large and luscious red grapes. I know that it was there before the repeal of Prohibition, but you just never asked about that. Every fall, just as the leaves were turning orange and red, my grandfather would build a sukkah in the grape arbor, and we would have a Sukkot service there, replete with the fruits and vegetables of the harvest. Of course, grapes predominated. The roof of the sukkah was built in such a way that you could see the sky and the stars. This by design, as the sukkah replicated a temporary mobile structure constructed by the Israelites as they journeyed in the desert. There was a beautiful simplicity about their faith. Like their lives, it was not complicated by affectation or pretense, and when they prayed in the sukkah, it was somewhat reminiscent of the Angelus of Millet. They were truly grateful to God for having brought them to this land, and for the harvest, and for their blessings. Come to think of it, they entered into the celebration of Thanksgiving with much the same exuberance. I have never since experienced such earthy, heartfelt faith. My grandfather was a man who worked with his hands, and they showed it. They were calloused and lined, and though he washed them interminably, he could never fully eradicate all the dirt of the barrel yard. I don't know how he initially entered the barrel business, but I do remember that it was hard work. And on the occasions that I visited him there, he was working right alongside his men. I do know that he started with a horse and wagon, and they would leave early before dawn and venture down into the flats along the Cuyahoga River to pick up used barrels from the various smokestack industries along the riverbed. Cleveland was not only the home to the Standard Oil Company, where it had originated, but to such plants as Republic Steel, Warner and Swayze, Sherwin-Williams, and Chevrolet. The plants would leave their used barrels for him, and he would pay for them, and then he would recupera them, putting on new staves and copper where necessary, and sell them for reuse. He was scrupulously honest, and gave the factories a true count of their discarded barrels, and they knew it. And for this, he was rewarded with the exclusive right to collect the discarded barrels at many important industrial sites down in the flats. Over the years, this developed into a good business, one which enabled him by the sweat of his brow to send 2 sons through medical school and my mother through the School of Education at Western Reserve University. Eventually, the horse and wagon were replaced by a Mack truck. I had often remarked how run down and dirty it seemed. And then, sometime in the mid-1930s, Chaim and I became partners. He had just purchased a spanking brand-new International truck, and he invited us all down to the barrel yard to see it before it went to work. It had a red and white cab attached to a large 8-wheel load lugger, and the old man was quite proud of it. I said I was so glad that he had gotten rid of that old Mack truck that I wanted to contribute. I had saved up $2, and I wanted to become a 50-50 partner in that brand-new red and white International. Oh, that was fine, he said. He could use a partner, but which half did I want? Without a moment's hesitation, I said I'd take the cab. He could have the load lugger. We shook hands, and after that, I would always refer to the International as our truck, except the front half was mine. Chaim was good with his hands, and he used those hands to fix up old houses as well. At one point in the depth of the Depression, he began to buy up old dilapidated houses in the poorer sections of Cleveland. He would fix them up himself, and the rent provided a small but steady income. One of those houses he gave to me for my college education. It was sold, and the proceeds paid for all 4 years of my tuition, room, and board at Harvard College. My grandfather was many things, but musical he was not. I remember once discovering an old violin in the attic. It had a big round hole in the bottom of it. Why, I wondered, was Raisel keeping it, and how did the hole happen? I never received a satisfactory answer, but there was a story circulating around the family, which I'm sure was embellished over the years. That went something like this. Shale, as the youngest son, was given violin lessons. It was an ethnic tradition, but he wasn't very good at it. Unfortunately, his violin teacher was a rather mercurial and temperamental Italian, something of a martinet and a perfectionist. One day, my grandfather returned from the barrel yard while Shale was having a lesson, and he quite innocently asked whether Shale could play something. Shale obliged, and apparently it was dreadful. But my grandfather, with a tin ear, thought it was wonderful and kept saying, "That's nice," as the maestro smoldered. Finally, the impresario had had enough. He went berserk, grabbed the violin, smashed it over Shale's head, and ran out the door never to return. My grandmother was a sentimental sort, and she saved the violin, whole and all. And that's how it wound up in our attic, or so the story went. In any event, Shale never had to undergo the ordeal of music lessons again. That part was true. During the depths of the Depression, there wasn't much time for frivolity in their lives, but there was the annual barrel dealers' picnic at Euclid Beach. That was a blast I looked forward to all year long. I remembered it as if it were yesterday. In the week before the picnic, my grandfather brought home strips of tickets to the rides, yards of them. They seemed endless. You could go on any ride and all the rides again and again and never use up even half of those barrel dealer tickets. I remember going with Chaim on the whirling dervish, where everyone got onto the middle and hung on, and then the floor started whirling round and round until one by one people were pulled out by centrifugal force, I guess, until the winner alone remained in the middle and got a prize, usually a stuffed animal. And then there was the barrel roll, where they played roll out the barrel. You entered a gigantic barrel which was lying on its side and suddenly began to whirl round and round and round, and you had to run at full speed as if you were treading water to avoid falling down. Eventually everybody fell at least once. I always went through the fun house with the crazy mirrors which blew you up all out of shape, fat and skinny, short and tall. And I never missed the Dodgems, those great rubber-bumpered cars where you could crash into everybody with impunity, and there was no referee at all. It all seems rather primitive and unsophisticated now looking back on it, but it was great fun and a great relief from the grinding existence of the blue-collar working man during the Great Depression. When my parents went on vacation together, I would stay with my grandparents at the Englewood Road house, and my grandfather would tell me stories. They were a blend of Russian folk tales and stories of his 4 years in the army of the Tsar, and I would ask to hear them over and over. The folk tales were almost always about animals and fish, most often about wolves, foxes, and fish. I remember one in particular. Fisherman was driving a wagon with his cats through the forest on his way to the market. A wily fox wanted those fish in the worst way, but he was too small to make the leap up onto the wagon. So he persuaded the hungry wolf, who was larger, to jump up and throw the fish down, and as the wagon went along, the fox would hide them from spot to spot in the woods. The hungry wolf obliged, but lo and behold, instead of hiding the fish, the fox ate them, and when the wolf finally finished and descended from the wagon, the wily fox and the fish had vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. I realize now, after reading Professor Benjamin's account of Streshin, that the tales Chaim related to me of fishermen and of the creatures of the woods were perfectly natural. Since Streshin was located on the Dnieper River, there was a fish market on the pier, and it was also located near dense wooded areas. The folk tales fit the environment like a glove. Although I knew the ending by heart, I asked for this and similar Russian folk tales over and over, just as I never tired of hearing my grandfather tell me stories about his days in the Russian army. He apparently had spent 4 peacetime years in the army of the Tsar, and he did well as a soldier. He was a marksman and was so good that he was chosen to represent his regiment in sharpshooting contests, and he won medals for them, but he could never advance into the officer corps because he was Jewish. I had a chance to test whether he in fact had such shooting skills, or whether the tales were illusory. At one point in my young life, I saved up enough box tops to finally send away for a Red Ryder BB gun. When it arrived, I took it out behind the garage and lined up a bunch of old tin cans at about 200 feet. One day after work in the summertime, my grandfather came back there and picked up the gun and asked whether he could have a go at it. I said, sure. He lined up the cans and then popped them off one by one at 200 feet. He never missed. They're still probably picking my BBs out of the clapboard on the back of the garage, but none were the result of my grandfather. The tales weren't fantasy after all. Beside Russian folk tales and stories of his days in the Russian army, my grandfather would regale me with tales of Shale as a youngster. Shale was the youngest of 4 children, and he was a maverick as a kid. I guess a lot of younger siblings are. In any event, Shale was always getting into trouble. I remember one story my grandfather told of being called home from the burial yard in the middle of the day and being asked to bring a ladder quickly. Shale had somehow managed to climb onto the neighbor's roof. Nobody knew how he got there, but nobody knew how to get him down either. My grandfather knew and retrieved him, but Shale never forgot it. The story that sticks in my mind the most is the story of Shale going off to Morgantown, West Virginia, to college. They sent him off with a new suit. Now, a suit was a major expenditure in those days. Shale returned after his first semester without the suit. He had given the suit to a poor student from the Far East who had no money to buy clothes and who was cold. When my grandfather would tell that story, my grandmother would let out a sigh of desperation. But I could tell that the old man admired Shale for what he had done, because it was something he would have done himself. I could tell by his smile. In the early 1900s, two strange and inseparable brothers from Worcester, Ohio, neither of whom had finished the 8th grade, with the unlikely names of Oris and Mattis Van Swearingen, remade downtown Cleveland and built a landmark building there called the Terminal Tower. They then proceeded to create the nation's first planned community, Shaker Heights, before embarking on a career as railroad tycoons, which witnessed their meteoric rise and then their disastrous fall as the market crash of 1929 reduced their pyramid schemes to ashes. Oris and Mattis lived in a secluded, sprawling mansion in Cleveland Heights surrounded by a stone wall which covered an entire city block. I remember my parents pointing it out to me time and again as they spit out the car window when we drove by. The mansion was so secluded that not even servants were allowed entry, and so the strange Van Swearingen brothers lived alone. Oris and Mattis, however, were not only secluded, they were notorious anti-Semites. And as a result, Shaker Heights was not only planned, it was exclusive in the extreme. But apparently with the downfall of Van Swearingen's railroad and real estate empires, things had loosened just enough so that in 1934, my parents were able to rent the upstairs floor of a two-family house at 3685 Linfield Road. Shaker Heights reputedly had the best public education east of the Terminal Tower, and my primary education there began in Lomond Elementary School. 5 years later, in 1939, when Shaker Heights was still a white Anglo-Saxon enclave, Chaim and Razel bought a two-family house together with my parents just down the street at 18507 Newell Road. There were 2 bedrooms on each of the first and second floors. My parents and I lived downstairs, and my grandparents lived upstairs. Since I was only 9, when my parents would go out at night, I would sleep upstairs with my grandparents. Eventually, this bedroom arrangement became a permanent one, with my bedroom downstairs was turned into a much-needed library study. My memories of my life with my grandparents during this very formative period of my life are vivid, for these were the war years. Shortly after we moved into our own home on Newell Road on September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and war was declared in Europe. A little over 2 years later came Pearl Harbor, and suddenly we were at war with both Germany and Japan. There wasn't much celebrating in those years. Even New Year's Eve celebrations were muted. But I do remember that New Year's Eve was still special, and on that night my grandparents allowed me to stay up, if I could, to hear the factory whistles. The whistles sounded off for a full 10 minutes down in the flats on the Cuyahoga River, and we could hear them loud and clear over 10 miles away in Shaker Heights. Chaim and Razel never went out on New Year's Eve, nor was there any cause to celebrate, as Shale, who was then living in St. Louis and had just become a father, had volunteered to serve in the 101st Airborne Division. I remember that shortly after he was sworn in, my grandmother hung a little flag in the window. It consisted of a blue star on a white field with a red border. My grandparents both took great pride in that little flag. It was almost as if it were a badge of belonging in this pristine, new neighborhood. Although it was the first such flag on our block, it was soon joined by a number of others. But before a year had passed, the first gold star flag appeared in our neighborhood, signifying a son killed or reported missing in action. And my grandmother shuddered. Whenever another gold star flag would appear, she would look the other way when she passed the house, as if to ward off the angel of death hovering there. My friend Jimmy and I started a movie theater in the basement of our house, which we called the Victory Theater. We could only show silent films, of course, but none of our buddies had sound projectors yet either. So we printed passes in industrial arts class and set up shop with a collapsible movie screen, my new projector, and some bridge chairs. I remember that the passes we printed up had 5 circles on them to be punched on admission, just like the movie passes at the junior high school. And I think we sold them for 5 cents. We rented the movies from a man who sold them out of his home somewhere off Kinsman Road, far enough away that I had to take a streetcar there every Monday after school to exchange films. Actually, I look forward to those trips because I got to see what exciting new films were being offered. We placed a little sign on the front lawn of the house advertising the newest film, and we put on a pretty good show for the money. There was always one main feature, usually a Castle film, newsreel, then a Tom Mix or a Red Ryder short subject, and finally 1 or 2 cartoons like Mickey Mouse or Felix the Cat. The neighborhood kids loved it. Besides, there wasn't much other entertainment around during the week. Jimmy and I, it seems, had the only game in town. And one day my father returned home early and spotted kids running up and down the basement stairs. Suddenly, visions of personal injury lawsuits began to swirl through his head, and the Victory Theater was about to come to an ignominious end right then and there. My grandfather, Chaim, intervened. Somehow, he persuaded my father that the enterprise was worth the risk, that Jimmy and I would be careful about the kids running up and down, and really, the stairs weren't all that steep anyway. Besides, they had handrails to hold on to. In any event, the Victory Theater was saved. About a month later, our supplier ran out of new films and the theater closed for good. But Jimmy and I never forgot what my grandfather had done for us. Chaim was the patriarch of his family. He had brought many relatives over from Streshin, and a number of them had lived with him on Englewood Road. In fact, he had given many of them jobs in his barrel yard until they could get started on their own. Again, the Maimonidean syndrome. The clan loved to gather, so every so often on a Sunday the Dworkin clan from Streshin would get together at my grandparents' home in Lily-White, Shaker Heights. On Sunday afternoons, the covers came off the furniture in the living room, and I can remember them all gathered around the big oak dining room table in a room filled with cigar and pipe smoke and a table filled with blue seltzer bottles, the ones with the little metal contraptions that sprayed. And there were always bottles of Cotton Club cherry soda and sarsaparilla. Sarsaparilla tastes just like root beer. In fact, I think it actually is root beer. So I could never figure out why they just didn't buy root beer. Maybe they just fell in love with the name sarsaparilla. It has a certain ring to it, sort of like ordering Pinot Grigio instead of just white wine. When we first moved on to Linfield and Newell Roads and Shaker Heights, we were virtually the only Jews on both blocks. In fact, for several years, I needed to bring a note into school on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur explaining what these strange holidays were about. Although we never hid our ethnicity from anybody, we did not go out of our way to be conspicuous about it either. In any event, one of the Streshin clan named Izzy was in the kosher chicken business. He killed them, he plucked them, he cleaned them, and he prepared them right before your eyes there in his shop. He also delivered, and therein lies a tale. Izzy had a chicken truck, and apparently it was the only form of transportation that Izzy and Mrs. Izzy had. And when they came to the Streshin clan gathering on Newell Road in pristine Shaker Heights, they insisted on coming in their truck and parking it directly in front of our house. The truck announced in big, bold letters, in both Hebrew and English, just what it was: Izzy's Fresh Glot Kosher Chickens. I can remember my father staring out the front window at that truck and fuming as his face turned ever-deepening shades of red. He was seething like a volcano about to erupt. Finally, when he could contain himself no longer, he turned on my grandfather in a rage. "Tell Izzy to get that damn thing away from here. Can't he come in something else? Tell someone else to bring him in a car." But Izzy was not to be deterred, nor was Chaim. My grandfather was not easily intimidated. Izzy could damn well come, truck or no truck, and Chaim was not about to disinvite him. The neighbors could go to hell. This is America, not Russia. Conformity was never a virtue with Chaim. And so it was that Izzy's Fresh Glot Kosher Chickens continued their Sunday afternoon sojourn into the heart of Van Swearingen country. I often wonder whether Horus and Mantis ever knew. But the war years were upon us now in earnest. Rationing tightened, the casualty figures continued to mount month after month, the Japanese continued to advance in the Pacific, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union and were slicing through Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine like a hot knife through butter. The news, it seemed, was all bleak. Sunday night, however, was a special time. It was a time for Chaim and Razel to sit around the old console Philco radio in the living room and listen to news commentators. There were Drew Pearson, Walter Winchell, Dorothy Thompson. Best of all, there was a commentator named Gabriel Heater. I remember Chaim and Razel glued to that Philco radio as the Battle of Stalingrad raged on, and Heater would dramatically begin each weekly broadcast with, "Ah, yes, my friends, 30 days, and Stalingrad still holds out against overwhelming odds." And then, "Ah, yes, my friends, 60 days, and Stalingrad still holds out against overwhelming odds." Hitler had issued a do-or-die order to the Wehrmacht not to retreat from Stalingrad, and the Nazi war machine had poured its best commanders and ammunition into the battle. But the Russians fought them from house to house, and winter was coming. And despite all the memories of the pogroms, and there were many, and they were still vivid, Chaim and Razel still swelled with pride at the fortitude of the Russian people fighting house to house amidst a vast landscape of rubble and burnt ruins, holding out against overwhelming odds at Stalingrad. Stalingrad, now known as Volgograd, was not that far from Streshin, and it too was on a river. Chaim and Razel knew the territory, and they knew the people. Despite all they had suffered in Russia, my grandparents still had great empathy for the Russian people, many of whom they felt had suffered with them under the repressive regime of the Tsars, and many of whom had warned them of the upcoming pogroms ordered by the Tsars, so that Chaim and Razel and their parents could hide in cellars until the mayhem had passed through. Although Chaim and Razel despised Bolshevism and all that it stood for, they had great admiration for the people fighting to preserve their homeland. So it was a strange admixture of emotions that surrounded that old Philco radio on Sunday nights as Gabriel Heater took to the airwaves. Hitler's defeat at Stalingrad, of course, was the turning point of the war in Europe and led to the crushing German retreat in the snow, paralleling in many respects the disastrous military misadventure of Napoleon in 1812. Chaim would pray with tefillin every morning at dawn before going to work. I never knew him to miss a day, except, of course, on Shabbat, when it was forbidden to don tefillin. But never did he pray harder than during the period December 44 to June 1945, months that seemed like an eternity at 18507 Newell Road. I was the professional letter writer for my grandparents and was paid 5 cents a letter. They would dictate, I would write. From the time Shale enlisted, they would write him at least once a week, and he would write back. When he went overseas, these letters would have to be written on V-mail, which is a very thin letter envelope that then went postage-free and was prescribed by the government for all correspondence with servicemen and women, as it could easily be opened and read by censors, which it was. After December 1944, however, the V-mail from Shale, which had been constant throughout the war, suddenly stopped. No word whatsoever of his whereabouts. We knew that the 101st Airborne had been at the Battle of the Bulge, and that there were many casualties. Every night as I lay in bed, I could hear my grandmother cry herself to sleep. It was a painful time, despite the fact that the war in Europe was clearly and inexorably grinding toward an Allied victory. But Chaim and Razel were stoics. They refused to give up hope. They refused to place a gold star flag in the window. There was no Kaddish to be said. I kept writing V-mails for them, but it seemed futile. No response, no word of his whereabouts. Then one morning in June 1945, word from Shale finally arrived. He was alive. He had been liberated. He was coming home. He was thinner, but he was in one piece. In all of my life, I have never known such joy. Early on a Sunday morning, late in June, he arrived at the house on Newell Road. It was an extraordinary day. I had never seen my grandparents celebrate with such unbridled emotion and such schnapps. Shale was much thinner than I remembered him, and he had lost some hair, but he was well. Although he was ebullient and obviously grateful to be alive, he was reluctant to say much about what had happened. The story of the Battle of the Bulge and the details of the Death March I was to glean much later from books and from Shale's personal correspondence with his prison guards. But I never really understood the legend he had become until I began to flesh out the background from which he had emerged. When I considered the character of the two people I had lived with during my formative years, and then learned of the culture which had spawned them in the 1880s, the amazing actions of the frontline surgeon, which were so incomprehensible to his German captors, suddenly began to make sense. It had all really begun in a little shtetl called Streshin on the Dnieper River. But it was nurtured by two God-fearing, humble, but powerful and resilient people who had found a home in the heartland of the New World and who had now become an inherent part of its greatness. They were my heritage of Streshin.